Welcome to another edition of PowerCore Productions and Podcastings. And today we're going to be continuing Bleach Legacy, What If Superman Was in Bleach, Season 1, Part 3. As always, if you're new to the channel or if you're a regular and like what we have to offer, then please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, share, and hit that bell for post notifications so you can stay up to date on everything that is PowerCore Productions and Podcastings that's to come out now and in the future. Anyway, where we last left off with this series, we had Superman and Ichigo, aka Clark Kurosaki as he was adopted by Ichigo's family in this timeline, beginning their journeys in their respective roles as heroes, if you will. Clark learning more about his Kryptonian heritage, as well as Ichigo acclimating to the roles of being the substitute Soul Reaper. Despite having powers that come from two opposite ends of the spectrum, they are both bonded by a duty of family and brotherhood. As such, the two stand side by side as they battle against the threat of the Hollows and otherworldly beings, whether it be from the mystic or from beyond the stars. We follow along as we now see our two heroes continue in their journey. So, as always, sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. For Ichigo and Clark, as they continued on in their battle against the Hollows, the two start to become more adept at using their powers. For Ichigo, the powers of a substitute Soul Reaper, learning how to swing the massive blade that he summoned forth whenever he entered into his Shinigami form, along with Clark, who, for so long, had been so hesitant with using any of his power, considering the fact that he was just trying to learn how to keep it under control. For Clark, it was like being a bull in a china shop. It was very difficult for him at times to not let loose the amounts of power that he had within himself. As such, when fighting against the Hollows, you could say that it was one of the first times in almost forever that he was actually able to give himself a decent challenge, to truly see what he was capable of. Rukia couldn't help but be impressed by the two. For Ichigo, his talents as a Soul Reaper, and then there was Clark as well. His talents were almost limitless. She wondered if he could be capable of learning to use spiritual pressure. He had the ability to see hollows and spirits just fine, and he had the strength capable of interacting with them and of fighting on a very high level. Of course, with all this potential, there were bound to be some growing pains. For one, despite Clark's best efforts, a few times people saw the streaking of blue and red, and after a while speculation began about what this mysterious being could be. Some thought he was a bird, some thought he was a plane, some had other weird ideas, but all in all, while they couldn't really confirm it, they knew there was something out there. This was one of the drawbacks for Clark, as when Ichigo entered into his Shinigami form, no one could see him because he was nothing more but a spirit. And, well, unlike him, Clark, he could be seen. Although thankfully, with the disguise, if you can even call it that, it was hard for people to distinguish who he was. Clark took on the demeanor of being weak and mild. Not that he didn't have the trait of being mild, but by no means was he weak. Even though he had a larger size and frame, he didn't play sports, he didn't stand out. For many people, they thought that Clark Kurosaki was nothing more but a quiet, almost church-like mouse sort of person. The type of personality that never wanted to step on people's toes. The person who would just as quickly roll over for the other person rather than being as assertive and aggressive as his brother Ichigo. As such, between the contrasting dynamics, it was pretty hard for people to tell the difference initially. Although, for everyone at school, there was one person who was more enamored with the idea of this strange and mysterious being. That being the transfer student Lois Lane. She had been wanting to get a scoop for a while now. None of her stories were really panning out, but this was something concrete, something she could definitely sink her teeth into. She would tell anyone that would listen she was going to find out who this mysterious individual was that was dressed in blue and red. She was going to figure out for herself by any means necessary. On one hand, Clark felt a little relieved, seeing as how she was that determined to get closer to him, although she didn't know it was him. I mean, in her mind, they were probably two completely different people. And even if so, he wasn't going to reveal his secret identity anytime soon. Between this hollow business and everything else they were dealing with, the last thing he wanted was Lois to get involved, especially after what had happened with her and Orihime when Orihime's brother's soul had almost turned into a hollow. However, they weren't the only ones who were being interested into the strange goings-on of Kurakura Town. There was also Ichigo and Clark's friend. His name was Yatsuro Sado, although they called him Chad for short. Chad had been going through a strange phenomenon himself, that being in the form of a cursed cockatiel bird that had been inhabited by the soul of a small boy who had died. However, it was said that supposed misfortune followed anyone who came into possession of the bird, and this came in the form of a hollow named Shrieker, one of whom had been stalking the boy's soul. While Chad, not knowing much about souls and things of that nature, felt a bond and a connection to the young boy's soul. As such, he wasn't going to let him come to harm, and, despite not having much of a defense, would actually decide to take on and fight against the hollow. Rukia had been made aware of this and would come to his aid, alerting both Ichigo and Clark to help assist her in the battle. Of course, Chad couldn't make sense of everything that was going on, and for Rukia, she knew she was going to have to blot out his memories when all this was over. But even still, she was also impressed by Chad. He could just vaguely see the vestiges of the hollow, and he had decent strength. Beyond that of just the average human, he was capable of holding his own. Not that he was going to make any extensive damage against the thing, no. But still, he was doing better than how you would expect any human to do in this situation. For Rukia, she started to question a lot of things. First there was Ichigo, then there was Clark, now there was Chad. A lot of these individuals in Kurakura Town had a lot of spiritual energy potential, not just to perceive hollows, but to even combat them. This town was far from ordinary, and the more time passed, the more she began to wonder, was it by chance that she came to this town? That she had met the people that she did? There was definitely more to them than met the eye. Before long, Ichigo and Clark would arrive, as they would help Chad in the battle against the hollow known as Shrieker, ultimately defeating him. For Shrieker, who originated in his life as a murderer, as an evil and vindictive soul, he was dragged to the gates of hell, dissolving into the Soul Society. However, for the soul of the young boy who had inhabited the cockatiel, he would be released by Ichigo, allowed to move on peacefully into the Soul Society. In the end, the young boy was thankful to Chad and for all of them for helping him, and they wished him well on his journey, hoping that in death he could finally find peace of mind. In the end, Rukia would use one of her tools that she had gotten from a person she referred to as Urahara. He ran a shop that made special items for those from Soul Society. It's where she got her Gigai from that allowed her to inhabit this world and actually be seen. Using one of those tools, they were able to wipe Chad's memory so that everything that happened was little more than a dream. However, in the meantime, the group was dealing with another issue. That being that Ichigo had to do something with his body. You see, every time Rukia used that special glove of hers to just drag his soul out, his body would just be left behind, completely unattended. As such, Rukia came up with the idea of using a mod soul. It was another item that came from Urahara's shop. It was using something called soul candy. You see, a mod soul is an artificial warrior created by the Soul Society to help destroy hollows. When there's an empty body, you pop that candy inside of the being's mouth, and that soul basically takes over the body. It's like using a body like a car, more or less. Well, unfortunately for Ichigo, the mod soul that Rukia had given him was a bit of a recluse, to say the least. Someone who wasn't really fond of all that much fighting, but was more than happy to go on a rampage in Ichigo's body, doing things that were more obscene than ordinary, to say the least. And for Ichigo, it was ruining his social reputation. Thankfully, it wouldn't take long for them to confront the mod soul, and eventually they were able to help get Ichigo's body back. This would, however, invite an unlikeliest of individuals, someone Ichigo referred to as Hat and Clogs, Kisuke Urahara, the friendly merchant with shaggy, ruffy hair, sunglasses, a bucket hat, and walked around with a cane. He looked as though he were living the good life for a merchant, someone who was all in all just going with the flow of things. He was very laid back and wasn't the kind of person to get bent out of shape over every little misfortune. He was also in charge of running this shop, specifically to help those in Soul Society whenever they popped into town and they needed to get their hands on a little something something. More or less, though, he had come to take responsibility for the mod souls, since they were defective and technically speaking weren't supposed to be used, so selling that was supposed to be something on the low. However, for Ichigo, the mod soul that had taken over his body, the candy in particular, he didn't want to give it up. Rather, he stuffed it into a plush lion. As such, it would take on that form, although a lot smaller, a lot less intimidating, and a lot more weaker. In its horror, it had no idea why it was subjugated to such a fate, and Ichigo would explain it was payback for taking his body for a joyride, and that they were going to be keeping him around, since, whether he liked it or not, he was going to need some help. Every time he had to go and fight hollows, he couldn't just leave his body lying around, defenseless. So, after naming this individual Kon, he was going to be the one in charge of looking after Ichigo's body until Ichigo was finished with business. However, all was not well back within the Soul Society, as a Soul Reaper in particular had been dispatched, specifically to get Rukia. It was of the utmost importance. On one day in particular, Ichigo, Karin, Yuzu, Clark, and their father were all getting ready to leave. This day was an important day in particular, a somber one, not a day that was looked upon very fondly, especially for Ichigo and for Clark. They walked up a long hill, Ichigo's father being more energetic than normal, the two sisters being embarrassed by their dad, and Ichigo and Clark simply smiling to themselves as they watched the scenery pass by. Where were they going, you might ask? They were heading to the grave of their mother, for today was the anniversary of her death. And it was on this day that for Ichigo and Clark, their lives changed, but for different reasons. It was a day that they didn't talk about very much, because it was a day that both boys would never forget. For Ichigo, it was the day he truly felt helpless because he couldn't save his mother. And for Clark, it was the day that filled him with the most regret because he watched his mother die, and it was all his fault. This concludes Bleach Legacy. What if Superman was in Bleach? Season 1, Part 3. As always, if you enjoyed today's video and everything else that we have to offer, then please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, share, and hit that bell for post notifications so you can stay up to date on everything that is PowerCore Productions and Podcastings that has to come out now and in the future. Stay tuned for tomorrow's video as we're going to be continuing Konosuba, the explosive sage of the wonderful world. What if Jiraiya was in Konosuba, Part 3. But anyway, that's going to do it for the end of today's video. I'm Javon Harrington with PowerCore Productions and Podcastings, signing off, and I'll see you next time.